Some of the strongest cards in the game can realistically only be played in your side deck because of how reliant they are on you going first. And in today's tier list, I'm going to be going over some of the best going first staple cards that you could consider putting into your side deck. Now, the reason I say side deck is because you're realistically not going to be playing any of these cards in your main deck for the most part in a competitive strategy, aside from a few exceptions. Without any further ado, let's hop straight into it. So starting off with the very first card being Daruma Cannon, I think Daruma Cannon is a pretty solid card as an interruption, being able to go first and to have the potential to stop your opponent from fully comboing off, and having the potential to get rid of some key monsters as well that are links. I think this is a very strong card and also can maybe have some applications both in your very first turn or even if it's drawn later in the game. So I feel like this is a card that has quite a bit of potential, and even though it isn't necessarily as unfair or high impact as some of these other cards on here, I still feel like it's something you could consider if your deck needs a few more defensive options that is a little more flexible. Next up is Shared Ride, and I think Shared Ride has the potential to be quite strong in the right formats, but I'm not so sure this one is the correct one. But I think the problem is a lot of the decks that are doing all the searching will just try to OTK you that same turn, and you're relying on drawing your hand traps to actually be able to stop your opponent from fully comboing off. While that can be pretty strong, I still feel like a card like this, which essentially depends on what you draw off of it and it can be sort of played around by your opponent, I feel like this card has some potential, but I don't really think this is the right format for it at the moment. Next up is Dimensional Fissure, and I think Dimensional Fissure is very specific to certain decks. Not every deck's going to be able to play it, of course, but I feel like for the decks that are able to play it, it is a very strong card, so I probably put it in the high potential tier. It can stop certain hand traps like Ogre and Droll. Not only does it protect you against those hand traps, but also can be a good floodgate against a lot of the top decks right now, so I feel like this is definitely a very good card, but I'm not putting it inside deck staple because not every deck can play it. Next up is Power Filter, and I think Power Filter is in a similar spot as Dimensional Fissure. It's very strong against the top decks right now, but it's not going to be able to be played by most decks. Most of the time you're going to see it in Tempai Dragons, but outside of that you can't really play this in a card like Yugioh or Snake Eyes because you need to summon monsters that with 1000 or less attack. While it's very strong against the top decks, not every deck's going to play it, so same idea as Dimensional Fissure. If your deck can play it, I definitely consider putting it in. From personal experience, this card has been very good at just completely shutting out a Yugioh or a Snake Eyes player, and if those are the best decks of the format like they are right now. Next up is Lullaby of Obedience. Lullaby of Obedience can be quite strong in a mirror match, and if you're playing one of the best decks and you expect to face a lot of mirror matches like Snake Eyes or Yugioh, this is definitely a card you want to see in your side deck. It can potentially act as an additional starter, giving you more consistency and allowing you to play more non-engine in your deck to give yourself the best chance of stopping your opponent's engine from going off. So I feel like this is very specific to a few decks, but if you're playing the best deck or the best decks of the format, this is definitely a card I'd consider putting into your side deck. Next up is Grave of the Super Ancient Organism. I think this card is not the best. There isn't anything too insane that it's stopping because a lot of decks have access to link monsters that can just simply out this even if they do play high level monsters. There are only a very few select matchups where I feel like this card could be good, so against decks like Tempai or against decks like Branded, but I feel like it doesn't have enough meta coverage in the current format to warrant playing it. So unless you're playing Runic Sun or something, I feel like this card is probably just like at the very bottom of potential. I only say that because maybe some decks struggle a lot with Tempai and Branded. It can be a pretty good floodgate against them, but other than that, I don't really think it's worth it at the moment. Next up is Gozen Match. I think Gozen Match is probably the worst out of these three right now. Snake Eyes can pretty much play a mono fire strategy if they really have to. Yugioh plays a mono dark strategy. Tempai plays mono fire. There's just so many decks with the same attribute that I just feel like it's never really super impactful against a lot of the decks at the moment. But on the other hand, I think Rivalry has a lot of potential. It's not great against Yugioh because everything is Fiend, but against a few other decks it can be pretty good. So against a deck like Snake Eyes as Amina, this is definitely a card you'd want to be putting into your side deck if your deck can play it. Against a deck like Branded is also very strong, but it doesn't necessarily hit everything, which is why I'm putting it in the potential tier. And plus, not every deck's going to be able to play it. Finally, There Can Be Only One. I think this is probably the strongest of the bunch. It does stop a lot more of the top decks like Tempai and Yugioh, but it really depends on the format as well, and I feel like it's marginally better than Rivalry of Warlords, but I'd still say it's a potential card because, once again, not every deck can play it. So overall, I feel like there can be only one. Rivalry and Gozen are pretty solid. Gozen definitely the worst out of the bunch, but if your deck can play TCBOO and Rivalry, it's probably worth putting it in just because of how impactful it can be against the right matchups. Next up is Magic Deflector, and I think Magic Deflector is very targeted hate. It doesn't really hit too many of the meta decks, even though all of them use field spells. I feel like the only one it's really going to be super impactful against is Yugioh, because they do rely on Nightmare Pain to get their combos going, in addition to having Nightmare Throne access. So I feel like while it's good into that matchup, it just doesn't really do enough into a lot of the other matchups at the moment. So it'd probably just go at the bottom of potential, maybe not even worth considering, because there are just better cards against Yugioh that also hit other decks at the moment. Next up is Crossout Designator, and I think Crossout Designator is probably going to be the first one I put into side deck staple. Pretty much every deck can play this. If you're playing a combo deck, it's very good going first to help you play through those hand traps, which your deck normally can't play through. Maybe even going second if your deck loses super hard to like one of these cards, you could choose to play it in your side deck as well. But in the context of going first, I think it's just so strong because a lot of the times, just being able to stop one super high impact hand trap can be enough to help you play through either the rest of your opponent's hand traps or just play uninterrupted. So I feel like this is definitely a card that you should be playing if you're playing one of those heavier combo decks. If you're playing more of like a mid-range control deck, I'm not really sure it's too worth it, but most of the top meta decks are decks that can take full advantage of Crossout at the moment. Next up are Simul Archfiends and Dimensional Barrier. I think these fall into a similar category. I personally still think Barrier is a little better than Simul Archfiends. Like, I put Barrier at like the bottom of 5 potential, Simul Archfiends at the top of potential. Barrier does have the potential to fully stop a deck like Tenpai Dragon, which can be nice. It has some applications against Yubel calling fusions because you turn off the Fiendsmith stuff, you turn off Phantom of Yubel, makes them more vulnerable to hand traps. But like, against the top 2 decks, there are definitely other cards that do more against them, and I feel like this can be a very targeted card towards those other matchups if you already have enough cards for the top 2 decks. Next up is Salesman. I think this is just the worst version of Crossout in every single way possible. I don't know why you'd ever play this because you're preemptively calling a card that your opponent might not even have, and I feel like you'd just rather have the flexibility of Crossout over this any day. Next up is Mistaken Arrest, or Mistake. I think this card has a lot of potential and could be very strong in the right decks, but the problem with it is that it lingers onto your turn as well. So unless your deck is one that can play without searching their deck, I feel like this card is probably just going to be relegated to the potential tier. Next up is Deck Lockdown. I think Deck Lockdown is a very powerful floodgate as well. It has the bonus effect on top of the Mistaken Arrest, essentially making it so your opponent can't special summon from the deck, which is very relevant against all 3 of the top decks right now. It stops a card like Chandra in Tenpai, it stops a card like OSS in the Snake Eyes deck, it stops a card like Spirit of Yubel, being able to summon Yubel from deck, or Samsara D Lotus. So there are quite a few cards that this stops, and all the cards I named are pretty vital parts of the top decks right now. So I feel like if your deck has the ability to play Deck Lockdown, you probably want to side deck it. Even if they have ways to play without searching, without those key engine cards like I just mentioned, those 3 decks are just not nearly as powerful as they are at the moment. Next up is Solemn Judgment. I think Solemn Judgment is just a overall pretty okay card. It's nothing crazy. It's pretty much always going to be a 1-for-1 trade, but it does allow you to stop quite a few cards that other cards wouldn't be able to deal with. So if you're playing more of a control deck, for example, you can stop cards like Lightning Storm, Harvey's Feather Duster, which not many other cards in the format can do. And if you're just playing a regular combo deck, it can be used to stop a powerful card like Dark Ruler No More or Evenly Matched. So I feel like it's definitely a card with solid potential. Like I would say this card is fine. There's nothing wrong with it inherently, but it's just maybe too fair of a card. Like it doesn't do enough on its own. Like if you're just setting a single non-engine card and it's Solemn Judgment, like it's fine, but quite a few decks can play through it. So I feel like you probably want to make sure that if you're playing this card, you're using it to stop cards that your deck normally wouldn't be able to stop, or using it to protect some high value cards like Floodgates, for example. And next up is Skill Drain. There's not much to really say about this card. It's just as strong as it was before, but now that it's at 1, maybe you won't play it all the time because you're not seeing it as consistently, but the few decks that can take advantage of this definitely think they will continue to play this just because of how powerful it is. Next up is Spellbound. I think Spellbound right now is not in the best spot. And the reason being, there's so many cards in the top decks that can just send away their monsters on the field to the graveyard, either through something like Nightmare Pain with the Yubel deck or with something like OSS in the Snake Eyes deck. And the problem with this card as well is there's so many decks right now that can continue to put out so many extenders on the field. It's going to be pretty hard for you to successfully use this card to put your opponent in a position where they can't continue to summon from the extra deck. So I feel like while it does have some niche uses, and I feel like maybe this format is not the one for it, just because there are just so many extenders right now, and they're just not a deck that loses super hard to this. This card is probably just not worth it at the moment, but it's a card I personally really like and would like to see do well in the future, but right now I just don't think this is the right format for it. Next up is Heatwave, and I think Heatwave is pretty much exclusively going to be used by Tenpai if it's used at all. In the context of a going first card, I think it's alright. I guess the best use case of it would be your opponent either uses something like Shifter or Mulcharmy Perulia or Fuvaros in the draw phase. You can't really do much, or you don't want to commit too hard into your opponent. Play this card, they can't do anything either, and it passes back to you, except essentially now you're going first into your opponent's probably empty board and you have a battle phase. So I think it could be pretty good in those situations. But then the problem becomes, what happens if your hand is solid and your opponent doesn't drop those cards on you? Then are you going to choose to play this or choose to play out your normal combo and risk getting hand trapped? It puts you kind of in a weird spot when you play this card if you're not playing a deck like Tenpai. So I feel like in terms of side deck card, I probably put it in potential. Maybe a deck like outside of Tenpai will be okay with just having your opponent pass their turn back to you, and you feel like you have a better chance of playing through their hand traps. But outside of that, I feel like they're just less risky cards that are always going to be more consistently good than Heatwave. Next up is the Black Goat Laughs, and I think the Black Goat Laughs is probably a card you wouldn't side like multiple copies of if your deck didn't have a way to like dump it to the graveyard. So what I mean is, like, in terms of a standalone side deck card, it's fine, it's pretty good, but it isn't super high impact compared to some of these other cards. And the reason people would play this is because your deck has extra access to it through their engine. So if your deck is playing Foolish Burial Goods, it can be a pretty solid card to play. Back in the day when Beatrice was a thing, this was also a really solid card to send. But nowadays, I feel like maybe if you're playing like a milling deck, or like I mentioned, cards like Foolish Burial Goods, it can be very strong. But outside of that, I wouldn't really consider playing like 3 copies of this ever as just a standalone side deck card. Next up is Imperial Ironwall. I think Imperial Ironwall is not great. There aren't too many decks that rely on banishing right now aside from maybe Runic. There just isn't enough decks that this hits, so this is just not really the right format for it in my opinion. But next up is Different Dimension Ground. I think Different Dimension Ground is also a card that is up there in terms of like how many decks it can hit. So I feel like it is going to be a pretty solid side deck staple no matter what deck you're playing. And the reason I say that is because while it is a lingering effect, it only lasts for the turn. So that means when your opponent passes it back to you, this card will no longer be applying and you can do your combo as normal. So even if you're playing a deck that relies on the graveyard, just having this to stop your opponent for a single turn and prevent their cards from hitting the graveyard that turn means when it goes back to you, you'll be able to combo without having to worry about your card's monsters getting banished. So I feel like for that reason, being a lingering floodgate and being able to hit so many of the top decks like Snake Eyes and Yubel just makes it a very powerful card that I feel like could be played in pretty much every single side deck. Next up, I guess, are the 2 viruses. So Deck Devastation Virus. This is the one that destroys monsters with 1500 or less attack, and it does hit a surprising amount of the current meta at the moment. So if you think about Snake Eyes, all their monsters are really small aside from Diabellstar, so you're going to be hitting out a lot of their key Snake Eyes monsters. I think the problem with this card is you're gonna have to find a really good timing to activate this card and to get the most value out of it, because otherwise if you shotgun it early, they might have other ways to search the small monsters out and still be able to use them even after this card is resolved. So I think that's one potential problem with the card. Another potential problem is that against the Yubel deck, if you're popping the Yubel monsters, they do get their effects. I think Tenpai's may be the deck that you can catch off guard with this. They only have so many extenders, so I feel like you could time this pretty easily. I don't really see this card getting talked about a lot, but I feel like it has some potential in the current format. It's just maybe is a little too risky right now and you want to go for something safer. Next up is Eradicator Epidemic Virus. So Eradicator is also a pretty solid card. The top decks play so many spells right now. Great thing about this card too is a lot of the decks right now have some way to like search a spell or commit a spell to the board that they can't activate right away. So what I mean is like Diabellstar is going to set like OSS, or the new Sinful Swallows card in the Snake Eyes deck. Spirit of Yubel is going to set Nightmare Pain onto the board. And when you flip this card at that time, you can take out those key engine pieces, which I feel like can catch your opponent off guard. Not to mention, this card also has applications against control decks as well. So against a deck like Runic or against the deck like Labyrinth, it can still be pretty solid. So I think this is probably going to go at the bottom of high potential. Once again, this is a card that's not easy to resolve because you need to be playing very specific decks, but for the decks that can play it, I feel like this is actually still a very strong card that you definitely want to keep in mind when you're choosing what cards to side deck. Next up is Solemn Strike, and I think Solemn Strike falls in a similar category as Solemn Judgment. You can argue it's slightly worse. It doesn't have the ability to protect your key back row cards, for example. But the thing with it is it does allow you to pair it with some other going first cards to sort of act as quote-unquote pseudo board breakers. But then it becomes like a 2-card combo that is super strong only when you see it with something else. So I feel like Solemn Judgment, there are probably better cards you can play, but it's an alright card overall. There's nothing inherently wrong with it in my opinion. Next up is Anti-Spell Fragrance. I think Anti-Spell Fragrance is pretty easily a side deck staple right now. It's pretty applicable into pretty much every single deck out there. Yubel, Snake Eyes, they all set spells to the field, so they're not going to be able to play those spell cards that are key parts of their engine, which I think can be very strong. The only thing I will say about Anti-Spell is, well, it does have a risk of it going back to you and you not being able to play as well. So like if you got hand trap turn 1, for example, or if you just didn't have that great of a hand to begin with, it can also slow you down and shut you out of the game as well. So that's something to keep in mind, but I feel like it's worth taking that risk to play this card just because of how strong it is. Next up is Unending Nightmare. It's very good against those decks like Runic. You can continually wipe out their Floodgates. You can target down Fountain, stuff like that. Also is solid into a deck like Yubel as well, just because of how many face-up cards, spells and traps they play, like Nightmare Throne and Nightmare Pain. But I feel like it's just a little too narrow in what it does. Yes, hitting spells and traps can be good, but none of the top decks will just auto lose if you hit a face-up spell or trap. Like, yes, they are very powerful cards, but I don't feel like it's powerful enough to just completely shut out an opponent's turn, which is what you're looking for in these side deck cards when you choose to play them. Next up is Power Sink Stone. In practice, it is going to be essentially the same as Skill Drain. I don't really know too many combo decks that can do most of their full combo with only 2 monster effects, so I feel like it falls in a similar category as Skill Drain. If you're looking for cards that just completely shut out monster effects, this can be a pretty solid one. You can argue it's a little worse than Skill Drain in that sense because it gives your opponent the opportunity to use some monster effects, but I feel like if you have a way to protect this, then it's probably going to be okay and essentially be the same thing as Skill Drain. Finally, we have Silent Graveyard. I think Silent Graveyard is a pretty mediocre card at the moment. There aren't that many top decks in the meta right now that will get completely destroyed without graveyard effects like Tierlist was back in the day, so I don't feel like it's worth playing at the moment. It's important to note that it does have some applications going second as well, being a quick play spell. Right now, I feel like you'd rather just play a card like Different Dimension Ground to prevent those graveyard effects anyways, and just have it be more applicable. So that's going to do it for the tier list. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below. Let me know if you think there are any cards I missed, or if you agree with some of the card placements. I'm curious to hear what you think. And if you haven't checked out my going second board breaker tier list yet, be sure to do so, so you have a better idea of what to side deck when you're going second in this format as well. So with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoy the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.